In the spring of 1970, on a dirt road outside of Lamar, Missouri, a John Deere dealer named Curtis Vance pulled his truck to the side of the road and watched something he couldn't quite believe. A man was plowing a field with mules, not a tractor, not even an old tractor. 2 actual mules, hitched to an actual plow, turning actual soil the same way farmers had done it 100 years ago. Curtis sat in his truck for a full minute, just watching. Then he started to laugh. He was still laughing when he pulled into the feed store 20 minutes later and told everyone what he'd seen. "You won't believe it," Curtis said, slapping the counter. "Old Earl Womack is out there plowing with mules. Mules. In 1970. I thought I'd driven through a time warp." The men at the counter laughed too. They all knew Earl Womack, knew his 120 acres on the south edge of the county, knew his quiet ways, knew he'd never quite joined the 20th century. "That's Earl for you," said one of the farmers. "Stubborn as his own mules." "Stubborn's one word for it," Curtis said. "I got another word. Embarrassing. This is 19. We've got men on the moon, and Earl Womack is farming with animals like it's 8. "You try selling him a tractor?" someone asked. "Try. I've been trying for 10 years. He comes into the showroom, looks at everything, asks questions, nods his head, and then goes home to his mules." Curtis shook his head in disgust. "Some people just can't be helped." "Maybe he can't afford it," another man suggested. "Earl Womack? He's got money. His daddy left him that farm free and clear, and he's been working it for 30 years. He could buy a new 40/20 cash if he wanted." Curtis leaned in, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "You know what I think? I think he's scared. Scared of progress, scared of change, scared of admitting that the old ways are dead." The men nodded sagely. That made sense. Earl Womack was afraid of the future. What none of them knew, what nobody in Barton County knew, was that Earl Womack had a secret, and that secret was going to make him the richest farmer in the county. Let me tell you about Earl Womack, because to understand what he was doing with those mules, you need to understand where he came from. Earl was born in 1915, in the same farmhouse where he still lived in 19. His father, Cornelius Womack, had worked that land with mules, a matched pair named Solomon and Sheba, from the day he bought it in 1898 until the day he died in 19. Earl grew up behind those mules. He learned to plow before he learned to drive. He could read the twitch of a mule's ear better than he could read a newspaper. By the time he was 15, he knew everything there was to know about working the land with animal power. Then came the war. Earl enlisted in January 1942, a month after Pearl Harbor. He was 26 years old, strong as oak, and ready to serve his country. The Army took one look at his background and assigned him to the Transportation Corps, not driving trucks, but handling the mules. Because the Army still used mules, a lot of them. In Italy, in the mountains where trucks couldn't go, mule trains carried supplies to troops fighting in terrain that hadn't changed much since the Roman legions marched through. Earl spent 2 years in those mountains, leading mule trains through places where one wrong step meant death, where the difference between a good muleteer and a bad one was measured in lives. He saw things in those mountains that he never talked about afterward, but he also learned things. Lessons that would shape the rest of his life. The first lesson was simple. Mules don't need gasoline. It sounds obvious when you say it out loud, but Earl had watched supply lines stretch and break, had seen trucks abandoned for lack of fuel, had witnessed entire operations grind to a halt because the gas didn't arrive, and through it all, the mules kept walking. They ate grass, hay, oats, things that grew from the ground. Things that didn't have to be shipped across an ocean. They could survive on forage that would starve a horse. They could work in cold that would freeze a truck's engine solid. When Earl came home in 1945, that lesson came with him. The second lesson was harder to explain. It was about planning, about patience, about thinking 10 moves ahead, while everyone else was thinking 1. In the mountains of Italy, Earl had learned that the man who survived wasn't the strongest or the fastest. It was the man who saw what was coming before it arrived. That lesson would take 25 years to pay off. Now let me tell you about Earl's return, because that's when his strategy began. When Earl came home from the war, his father was 4 years dead, and the farm was waiting for him. The Mules, a new pair, not Solomon and Sheba, were still there, maintained by a neighbor who'd kept things running in exchange for a share of the crop. Most of the returning veterans were eager to modernize. The war had introduced them to machines, trucks, jeeps, tanks, and they came home wanting to leave the old ways behind. Tractors were getting cheaper, more reliable, more available. The future was internal combustion, and everyone knew it. Earl bought a tractor. That surprised people. They expected the stubborn muleteer to stick with his animals. But in the fall of 1946, Earl Womack drove a brand-new Farmall M onto his property, parked it in his barn, and became for a few months the talk of the county. Even Earl's finally joining the modern age, people said. What they didn't see was what Earl did next. He used the tractor for exactly 1 season. He learned how it worked, how much fuel it consumed, how much maintenance it required. He kept meticulous records, every gallon of gas, every hour of operation, every repair and replacement part. Then in the spring of 1947, he parked the Farmall in his barn, covered it with a tarp, and went back to his mules. People thought he was crazy. They thought the tractor had broken down and he couldn't afford to fix it. They thought he'd tried modern farming and failed. Earl let them think whatever they wanted. He had a plan. Every year, while his neighbors bought bigger tractors and used more fuel, Earl kept working with mules, and every year he took the money he would have spent on gasoline, diesel, and repairs, and he put it in a savings account at the Lamar Farmers Bank. By 1955, he had enough to buy a better tractor, a Farmall 400, the most advanced model International Harvester made. He paid cash, drove it home, and parked it in his barn next to the old Farmall M. Then he went back to his mules. By 1960, he had 2 tractors in his barn, both maintained, both ready to run. And he was still farming with Jack and Jenny, the mule team he'd bought in 1952, named after his wartime mules in Italy. Let me pause here and explain Earl's thinking, because from the outside, it looked like madness. Earl Womack was not against tractors. He understood their advantages, the power, the speed, the efficiency. He knew that a man with a tractor could work more land in less time than a man with mules. But Earl also understood something that his neighbors didn't. He understood that tractors ran on oil, and oil came from far away, from Texas, from the Middle East, from places that Earl couldn't control and couldn't predict. The price of gasoline in 1970 had nothing to do with how hard Earl worked or how smart he farmed. It was determined by men in suits in cities he'd never visited, making decisions he'd never understand. Mules were different. Mules ate hay that grew in Earl's own fields. Mules drank water from Earl's own well. Mules produced manure that fertilized Earl's own soil. The cost of running a mule was almost entirely under Earl's control. More than that, mules reproduced. If Jenny had a foal, Earl had another mule, free. If his tractor broke down, he had to buy parts from a factory in Indiana. If his mule got sick, he called the veterinarian in Lamar, or he nursed the animal himself with knowledge passed down from his father. Earl had done the math. Over a 20-year period, assuming stable fuel prices, a tractor was more economical than mules. But Earl didn't trust stable fuel prices. He remembered the war. He remembered supply lines breaking. He remembered what happened when the fuel didn't arrive. So he kept his mules, and he kept his tractors in the barn, and he waited. Now let me tell you about Curtis Vance, because he plays an important role in this story. Curtis was the John Deere dealer in Lamar, and he'd been trying to sell Earl Womack a tractor for 15 years. Every spring, Earl would stop by the showroom, look at the new models, ask detailed questions about fuel consumption and maintenance schedules, and then leave without buying anything. It drove Curtis crazy. "I don't understand you, Earl," Curtis said one afternoon in 1968, after Earl had spent an hour examining a new 40-20 and then headed for the door. "You've got the money. You've got the land. Why are you still fooling around with those mules? Earl considered the question. He liked Curtis, in a way. The man was persistent, and there was something to admire in that. You ever been to war, Curtis? Curtis shifted uncomfortably. No, bad knee kept me out. I was in Italy. Mountains. Supply Corps. Earl looked out the showroom window at the parking lot full of shiny tractors. You know what I learned over there? I learned that the man with the longest supply line is the man who loses. Doesn't matter how good your equipment is if you can't feed it. This isn't a war, Earl. This is farming. Same principle. Earl tapped the hood of the 4020. This machine is better than my mules. Faster, stronger, more efficient. But it's got a supply line 3,000 miles long. My mules eat grass that grows in my own pasture. Curtis laughed. Earl, we're not going to run out of gasoline. This is America. We've got more oil than we know what to do with. Maybe, maybe not. Earl headed for the door. I'll tell you what, Curtis. If you're right, if gasoline stays cheap forever, then I'm a fool and everyone can laugh at me. But if I'm right, he paused at the doorway. Well, we'll see who's laughing then. He walked out, leaving Curtis shaking his head in disbelief. Crazy old mule, Curtis muttered. Stubborn as the animals he works with. The nickname stuck. Within a year, everyone in Barton County was calling Earl Old Mule Earl, or just Stubborn Mule. They meant it as an insult. Earl didn't mind. He'd been called worse things in Italy. Now let me tell you about 1973, because that's when Earl's patience started to pay off. In October 1973, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries announced an oil embargo against the United States. The reason was political, retaliation for American support of Israel during the Yom Kippur War, but the effect was economic devastation. Within weeks, gasoline prices doubled. Then they doubled again. Service stations ran dry. Lines stretched around blocks. The American economy, built on cheap and abundant oil, suddenly discovered what it felt like when the supply line broke. For farmers, the crisis was catastrophic. Everything in modern agriculture ran on petroleum. Tractors burned diesel, trucks burned gasoline, fertilizers were made from natural gas, the combines that harvested the crops, the trains that shipped the grain, the processing plants that turned wheat into flour, all of it depended on oil. When oil prices spiked, farming costs spiked with them. Earl's neighbors watched their profit margins evaporate overnight. The fuel that had cost them 30 cents a gallon in January was costing 60 cents by December. Their carefully planned budgets, based on years of stable prices, were suddenly worthless. Earl Womack's costs didn't change at all. Jack and Jenny still ate hay. They still drank well water. They still pulled the plow at the same steady pace they'd always pulled it, burning nothing but oats and grass. "How are you managing, Earl?" one of his neighbors asked that winter, when everyone was gathered at the feed store comparing horror stories. "Fuel costs must be killing you." "Don't use much fuel," Earl said. The room went quiet. Everyone knew Earl used mules. Everyone had laughed at him for it, but suddenly, in December 1973, with gasoline at 60 cents and climbing, nobody was laughing. "You serious?" another farmer asked. "You're still using those mules? Mules don't need gasoline. But your tractor, don't use the tractor much either." The farmers looked at each other. For 15 years they'd pitied Earl Womack, mocked him, called him backward and stubborn, and afraid of progress. Now, suddenly, they weren't sure who the fool was. Let me tell you about what happened next. Because the oil crisis was just the beginning. The embargo ended in March 1974, but gasoline prices never went back to what they'd been. The days of 30-cent fuel were gone forever. The new normal was 50 cents, 60 cents, eventually $1 and more. Earl's neighbors adapted. They had to. They found ways to use less fuel, to combine trips, to stretch every gallon. They complained constantly about costs, about margins, about the government and the Arabs and the oil companies. Earl just kept working his mules. But something had changed in how people looked at him. The mockery had faded, replaced by something that might have been respect, or at least grudging curiosity. Curtis Vance, the John Deere dealer, stopped trying to sell Earl a tractor. He even started asking Earl questions about mule husbandry. Hypothetically, of course. Just curious, nothing serious. Hypothetically, Curtis said one afternoon in 1976, if someone wanted to get a mule team going, how would they start? Earl smiled. It was the first time Curtis had ever seen him smile. Hypothetically, they'd start by finding a good pair of mules, young but trained. Then they'd need harness, plow, cultivator, and they'd need patience. Can't rush a mule. How much would all that cost? Hypothetically, less than a tractor. A lot less. Earl paused. But it wouldn't help you, Curtis. Not now. Why not? Because you'd have to learn. Takes years to learn to work a mule team properly. And you'd have to slow down. Mules don't go fast. They go steady. Earl looked at Curtis, and there was something almost kind in his eyes. You're not built for slow and steady, Curtis. You're built for fast and new. Nothing wrong with that. Just means mules aren't for you. Curtis didn't buy any mules. But he remembered that conversation. Now let me tell you about 1979, because that's when everything changed. The Iranian Revolution began in January. By year's end, the Shah had fled. Ayatollah Khomeini had taken power, and oil prices had tripled. Gasoline that had cost 60 cents in 1978 was suddenly costing $1.80. Diesel, the lifeblood of farm tractors, went from 50 cents to nearly $1.50. The fuel costs that had strained farm budgets in 1973 now threatened to destroy them entirely. Earl's neighbors were desperate. They had mortgages to pay, loans coming due, families to feed. But every time they filled their tractors, they watched their profits drain away into the gas tank. "I'm burning money," Dale Hoskins complained at the feed store that summer. Dale had the biggest operation in the county, 600 acres, 3 tractors, a combine, the works. He'd expanded aggressively in the early 70s, borrowing against his land to buy more land and more equipment. "Every gallon of diesel costs me $1.40. Do you know what that does to my margins?" "Same for everyone," another farmer said. "We're all bleeding." "Not everyone." Dale's voice was bitter. "Earl Womack's doing fine. Saw him out there yesterday with his mules, plowing away like it was 8. No fuel costs, no problems. Lucky bastard." Luck nothing, he knew. Dale shook his head. We all laughed at him, called him stubborn mule. But he knew this was coming. Nobody knew this was coming. Earl did. Or at least he planned like it might. Dale stared out the window at the gas station across the street, where the price signs showed numbers that would have seemed impossible 5 years ago. We all thought he was crazy. Turns out he was the only sane one. Let me tell you about Earl's barn, because that's where the real secret was hiding. On a September evening in 1979, Earl Womack walked into his barn and pulled the tarp off his 1955 Farmall 400. He hadn't started it in 6 months, hadn't driven it in over a year, but he'd maintained it, like he maintained everything. Oil changed regularly, battery charged, fuel system preserved against corrosion. The tractor was 24 years old, but it looked like it could roll off the lot tomorrow. Earl climbed into the seat and turned the key. The engine caught on the first try, rumbling to life with the sound of 4 decades of engineering. He sat there for a while, letting it idle, feeling the vibration through the seat. He'd owned this tractor for 24 years. He'd used it maybe 30 times for jobs that the mules couldn't handle, pulling stumps mostly, or moving heavy equipment. The rest of the time, it had sat here, waiting. Waiting for what? Earl had never been entirely sure. He just knew that someday the wait would be over. Now he knew. The next morning, Earl drove to the Lamar Farmers Bank and asked to speak with the loan officer. "I want to buy some land," Earl said. The loan officer blinked. Earl Womack had never borrowed money in his life. His father had left him the farm free and clear, and Earl had kept it that way for 34 years. What land? The Hoskins place. Heard Dale might be selling. The loan officer shifted uncomfortably. Dale Hoskins hadn't announced anything publicly, but the bank knew the truth. Dale's operation was hemorrhaging money. The fuel costs, combined with the loans he'd taken to expand, were crushing him. He couldn't make his payments. "I'm not sure the Hoskins property is available, Mr. Womack." "It will be." Earl's voice was calm. 6 months, a year at most. "When it is, I want to be ready." "Do you have funds for a purchase of that size?" Earl reached into his jacket and pulled out a bank book. He slid it across the desk. The loan officer opened it. His eyes widened. Earl Womack had $127,000 in his savings account. $127,000. Saved over 33 years, while his neighbors were spending money on fuel and equipment and expansion, while they were laughing at his mules and calling him crazy.
That's a substantial sum, Mr. Womack.
Should be enough for a down payment on the Hoskins place. Maybe enough to buy it outright, depending on what Dale's willing to take. The loan officer stared at the bank book, then at Earl, then back at the bank book. "You planned this," he said slowly. "All those years with the mules, you were saving for this." Earl smiled, that same quiet smile he'd shown Curtis Vance back in 1960. "I was planning for whatever came," he said. "Just so happens, this is what came. Let me tell you about the next 3 years, because that's when Earl's patience finally paid off in full." Dale Hoskins declared bankruptcy in the spring of 19. His 600 acres went to auction, along with his 3 tractors, his combine, and everything else he'd borrowed money to buy. Earl Womack was there, bank book in his pocket. He didn't buy the whole 600 acres. That would have been more than he could work, even with both tractors running. He bought 200 acres, the piece that bordered his own land, for $180 an acre, cash. Curtis Vance was at the auction too. He wasn't buying anything. His dealership was struggling, crushed between falling sales and rising costs. He was there to watch, like half the county. When Earl raised his hand for the final bid, Curtis started to laugh. But it wasn't the same laugh as before. It was something else. Admiration, maybe, or the dark humor of a man watching his own worldview collapse. "You crazy old mule," Curtis said as Earl went to sign the papers. "You actually did it." "Did what?" "Outlasted all of us. Sitting there with your mules, while we borrowed and expanded and modernized ourselves right into bankruptcy." Curtis shook his head. "You knew, didn't you? All those years. You knew something like this would happen." "Didn't know," Earl said. "Suspected. Planned for the possibility." He looked at Curtis, at the man who'd spent 15 years calling him backward and stubborn and afraid of progress. "You can't predict the future, Curtis, but you can prepare for it. The man with no debt and no fuel costs can survive things that break everyone else."
The mules.
The mules, and the savings, and the patience. Earl signed the last of the auction papers and tucked the deed into his pocket. Mostly the patience. Over the next 3 years, Earl bought 2 more properties from neighbors who couldn't make their payments. He never paid more than he could afford, never borrowed a dime, never overextended himself. By 1983, he owned 450 acres, nearly 4 times what he'd started with, and he started using his tractors. With 450 acres to work, mules weren't practical anymore. Earl finally pulled the covers off both farmalls, the old Mem from 1946 and the 400 from 1955, and put them to work full-time. People in town noticed. They talked. Earl finally joined the 20th century, they said. Only took him 40 years. Earl didn't bother explaining. He'd waited until fuel prices stabilized, until his neighbors were too broke to compete, until land was cheap and his savings were fat. Then, and only then, had he started using the tractors he'd owned for decades. The mules. Jack had died in 1978, Jenny in 1981, were retired to a pasture on the original 120 acres. Earl visited them every day until they passed. Then he buried them next to his father in the family cemetery behind the farmhouse. He didn't buy new mules. That chapter was closed. But he never forgot what they'd taught him. Now let me tell you about Curtis Vance. because his story has an ending too. The John Deere dealership in Lamar closed in 19... Curtis had fought to keep it open, but the math was impossible. Nobody was buying new tractors. Nobody could afford them. The dealership that had been the pride of the county for 25 years became another victim of the crisis. Curtis was 62 years old, unemployed, and facing the prospect of starting over. On a winter morning in 1983, he drove out to Earl Womack's farm. He wasn't sure why. Maybe to apologize. Maybe to ask for advice. Maybe just to see how the crazy old mule had ended up winning. Earl was in his barn, working on the farm Even with 450 acres to manage, he still did his own maintenance. Some habits never changed. Curtis. Earl looked up from the engine. Didn't expect to see you out here. Yeah. Well. Curtis shuffled his feet. Heard you're the biggest operator in the county now. Figured I should come pay my respects. Respects? You won, Earl. Whatever game you were playing, you won. Curtis leaned against the barn door, looking old and tired. I spent 15 years trying to sell you a tractor, telling you that mules were obsolete, that you needed to modernize, that you were embarrassing yourself, and the whole time you were planning for something like this. Wait, wasn't planning for anything specific, just preparing for possibilities. Same thing, isn't it? Earl considered that. Maybe. The war taught me that supplies run out, that the man who depends on things he can't control is the man who loses. The mules were my way of staying independent. He paused. The tractors in the barn were my way of staying ready. Curtis nodded slowly. You had them the whole time. The 400, the old M, just sitting there. Just waiting. Like me. For what? For the right moment. Earl wiped his hands on a rag and walked over to stand beside Curtis. You know what the Army taught me about strategy? It taught me that battles aren't won by the man with the best equipment or the most supplies. They're won by the man who picks the right moment to act, the man who waits while everyone else is rushing around, and then moves when the time is right. And the time is right now? The time was right 3 years ago. Land was cheap, fuel prices were stabilizing, and I had money when nobody else did. Earl looked out at his fields, 450 acres now, 4 times what his father had left him. The mules got me here, the patience kept me solvent, and the tractors, he patted the hood of the farm all 400. The tractors let me take advantage of the opportunity. Curtis was quiet for a long moment. Then he laughed, a genuine laugh, not the mocking kind he'd used for years. You know what, Earl? I spent my whole career selling people the idea that newer was better, that progress meant buying the latest model every year forever. And here you are with a tractor from 1955 and land from neighbors who believed what I was selling. Don't be too hard on yourself, Curtis. You believed it too. Yeah, I did. Curtis pushed himself off the door frame. What are you going to do with all this land? Farm it. Same as always. Maybe hire some help when I get too old to manage it all myself. Earl smiled. Won't be buying any new tractors, though. These 2 will last as long as I need them. They're almost 40 years old, and they run fine. Just like me. Curtis laughed again. He shook Earl's hand, climbed back in his truck, and drove away. He never called Earl stubborn mule again. None of them did. Let me end this story where it began. On a dirt road outside Lamar, with a man and his mules. Earl Womack died in 1998 at the age of 83. He worked his land until the last year of his life, finally slowing down when his body demanded it. His will was simple. The land, now 520 acres, expanded one last time with a purchase in 1991, went to his nephew's son, Thomas Womack. The tractors went with it. Both the old Farmall M and the Farmall 400, still running, both of them, still maintained to Earl's exacting standards. Thomas farms the land to this day. He uses modern equipment now, a 2015 John Deere that Earl would have admired for its engineering if not its price. But in the barn, under tarps, sit the 2 old Farmalls. Thomas starts them every spring, just to hear them run, just to remember. There's a photograph in the farmhouse, hung over the fireplace. It shows Earl in 1970 standing behind Jack and Jenny, working the fields while men in the background point and laugh. Earl is smiling in that photograph. A small, knowing smile. The smile of a man who sees something others don't. Below the photograph, in a frame, is a handwritten note. Thomas found it in Earl's papers after he died. A note Earl had written to himself sometime in the 19th. It reads, "They will laugh at the man with mules. Let them. The man who controls his own supplies controls his own fate. The man who waits for the right moment wins the war, not the battle. Be patient, be ready, and when the time comes, act." That was Earl Womack's secret. Not the mules, exactly, or the hidden tractors, or even the money he'd saved. The secret was simpler and harder than all of those things. The secret was patience, the willingness to be laughed at while waiting for the world to prove him right. Most people can't do that. Most people need to be right immediately, visibly, publicly. They need validation. They need to keep up with the neighbors, to own the latest equipment, to prove their success with things they can show. Earl Womack didn't need any of that. He needed only to know in his own heart that his plan was sound, and he was willing to wait 30 years to see it proven. That's the real lesson of this story. Not mules are better than tractors. They're not, for most purposes. Not new things are bad. They're often better than old things. Not even debt is always wrong. Sometimes borrowing makes sense. The lesson is simpler. Know what you're planning for. Prepare for possibilities, and have the patience to wait for your moment. The men who laughed at Earl Womack in 1970 were laughing at someone they didn't understand. They saw a backward farmer, afraid of change, clinging to the past. What they didn't see was a strategist, a man who understood supply lines and fuel costs and the vulnerability of systems that depend on things you can't control. A man who kept 2 tractors hidden in his barn, waiting for the day when everyone else's weakness would become his opportunity. They called him Stubborn Mule. He earned the name.